So for this next part of today's presentations, we'll have Chancellor White from Daniel White from UAF to talk about education and research at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. First, and then we'll have a presentation by Michelle Mack from Northern Arizona University to present the Bonanza Creek Long. I don't believe it. Please mute yourself. To talk about the long-term ecological research program here at Bonanza Creek in Fairbanks, Alaska, in the interior, in the Boreal Forest. And then a presentation by Beth Leigh from UAF and Lissy Goralnik from MSU on a project called In a Time of Change, which integrates ecological science with the arts and humanities in Alaska. And finally, we will have the honor to have our first art exhibit of the week by Margo Klass, on that we'll talk about Boreal Birch and how to use it as a medium and as a content. Okay, thank you very much. We have 1 minute. No, we have 3 seconds. We have no time for questions. If you have questions, please use the chat box. I'll stop sharing my screen. And yes, I can see Chancellor Daniel White here, and unmute. Okay, perfect. We can see you.
Well, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to address this group and to be able to take in a little bit of the work that's going on. And as someone who lives and works in the Boreal Forest, I very much appreciate the work of this international group. I've been at the Chancellor at UAF here in Fairbanks for the last 4 years, although I've lived and worked here at UAF for the last 26 years, and really had an opportunity to explore and do my own research. Of course, I was a civil engineer, worked on water resources in the had opportunities to work in the Caribou Poker Creeks research watershed, which is also in the Boreal Forest here, on water resources and movement of organic chemicals through the permafrost aquifers. So in any event, yeah, again, thanks. And I know some of you and I are here at UAF. I know some of you have worked at UAF and or come up to the Bonanza Creek or the Caribou Poker Creek research watersheds and worked. And for those of you who have, thank you for doing that, and thank you for being here at UAF and being part of what is a world-class research and education experience. For those of you who haven't, I invite you to come and see us up here. Come spend some time in our part of the Boreal watershed or the Boreal Forest, and learn and share your findings with us, so that as we live and work here, we can benefit from the great work that each other does. UAF, if you're not familiar with us, we are the global leaders in Arctic research. There is no other institution and actually no other government agency that publishes more on the Arctic than the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And even though we're a small research university, a lot of that kind of strength in research comes from our work with undergraduate students. And a very large proportion of our undergraduates do undergraduate research. And so we appreciate the fact that students coming here as freshmen can get out and start research work, so that as they get work through their undergraduate program, they are contributing to the research mission of the university, and many, of course, then go on to masters and PhDs. We are also a Alaska Native Serving Institution. 20% of our students are Alaska Native. And we start all of our meetings here with a land acknowledgement. And I'll just say that for us here at the Trottieta campus of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we are on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the lower Tanana River. And that's an important part of who we are as a university and as part of our educational and research mission. While we don't have 20%, 20% is the percentage of Alaska Native people in Alaska. And so our student body reflects that. Our faculty are still not 20%, but that's an area that we're striving for. As we kind of work our way through COVID and the challenges, and I know all of you at your universities are having the same thing. We here at UAF are focused on a culture of respect, diversity, inclusion, and caring, and making sure that all people feel a sense of belonging here at UAF. And if you are here and or have a chance to travel here, appreciate your keeping that in mind. And we are all masked up. I'm not masked up because I'm in my private office with my door closed, which is what our policy is. But to come visit us, keep the COVID protocols in mind, and keep each other safe and healthy during this time. So again, I think being in the Arctic matters. That's something we pride ourselves on here at UAF. Being in the boreal forest matters, and being able to live and work in the place that you study helps build a sense of understanding and a sense of belonging. So as we had a relatively mild, I guess I would say it was a pretty mild fire season, especially interested in the work that you all are doing on fire and fire behavior, because it makes a big difference on living conditions here in the boreal forest. So maybe I'll wrap up there, but Ellen, I'd be happy to answer any questions or address any specific topics that you would like.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. If there is any questions or any comments, you are please welcome to take the floor and ask questions to Chancellor White.
I'm looking around my Hollywood squares, but I'm not seeing any light up. So.
Well, if not, then we might take the extra time to move on. If I heard something. Nope. Thank you again very much for your speech, and if there is no question, then we'll move on to Michelle's presentation. If you are ready, Michelle.
Yeah, I think I'm ready. Can you hear me, Helene?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I'm going to share the right screen.
Okay, I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay, and there we go. Full screen?
Yeah, full screen.
Is that good?
To go.
All right, well, thank you very much, Chancellor White. And in particular, I want to thank you for the land acknowledgement, because that is an important starting place for the Bonanza Creek LTER program. So I'm really pleased to be able to be here today to tell you about long-term ecological research in Fairbanks, Alaska, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Our current focus is understanding cross-scale controls over the responses of the boreal forest to changing disturbance regimes. And as of last week, I became the principal investigator of this program. I am standing on the shoulders of boreal ecologists that you undoubtedly know well. Most recently, Roger Roos, who's just retired, but will also be giving a session this afternoon on trophic dynamics. Before that, Terry Chapin, and before him, Keith Van Cleve. So I'm very pleased to be moving forward in this position. Now, as you may know, the Bonanza Creek LTER is funded by both the National Science Foundation and the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. So it's a collaborative funded program. We're part of the National LTER network, and we receive substantial support from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the Institute of Arctic Biology, and also from Northern Arizona University and the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society, where I am a professor of ecosystem ecology. Now I want to start here. The boreal biome writ large. It's been fantastic in the last day to see people calling in from all corners of this remarkably homogeneous biome. So it's really cool to be able to come together and share similarities across the biome, but also to think about contrasts from which we might learn about processes and mechanisms. We, for the most part, all share fire-prone coniferous forests with long fire return intervals. Most part, we share a lag between production and decomposition processes that has led to the accumulation of globally important carbon stocks in forests and in soil. And we all share people embedded in this living landscape. They're deriving either economic benefit, subsistence benefit, spiritual benefit from these forests. Now, one thing that we all share and that we are all very closely focused on is the idea that these regions are warming. We know that high latitude regions are warming more than twice as fast as any other place on Earth. And in the areas around Fairbanks, we see warming of about 2.2 degrees centigrade over the last 60 years, but we also see drying. The mean annual precipitation has been relatively constant, hence increased drought in these regions. Now, if we were here together, you would be flying to Fairbanks. And one thing that the Bonanza Creek LTER group would do would be to take you out in the field to give you a sense of place, to communicate this place to you, but also to give you a sense of the science that has emerged from this place. And we likely would take you first to the Bonanza Creek Experimental Forest out here on the Tanana River. And you might see an overview of the Tanana River. We might go out in a boat where Diane Wagner and Knut Keeland would talk about consumers, small consumers like leaf miners, big consumers like moose, and how they play out in trophic dynamics of the boreal forest. We might go back to the bluff, the iconic bluff that looks out across the forest, have lunch, and then Jamie Hollingsworth, the site's manager, might drill a permafrost soil core, and then Teresa Hollingsworth might tell us the story of the history of the science of Bonanza Creek, going back to the initial study of primary succession on the Tanana River floodplain. We also might take you out to the Caribou Poker Creek Research Watershed, where you could look up into the hills and see the patterns of burning in these upland forests. We might hear from Jay Jones about the distribution of permafrost throughout the watershed and how that affects terrestrial aquatic transfers of materials and stream biogeochemistry. One of Tamara Harm's graduate students might show us water sampling in a thermokarst affected stream. And then we'll hear from Jamie Hollingsworth the story of the 2021 haystack fire, which burned two different components of the watershed here and kept everyone kind of with their breath held for several weeks this summer. Okay, finally, I want to bring your attention not to two places, but to many places in space. We know that interior Alaska, like many parts of the boreal forest, is shaped by fire. These are the fire scars from the last 50 years. And We know that in order to understand the dynamics of such a widespread disturbance regime, we have to better understand both spatial and temporal patterns of fire on the landscape. And so our last core set of sites is addressing the issue of increasing burned area in this region. And we think, based on the paleo record, that the burning that we see in this region is currently surpassing the limits of the past 10,000 years. So increased fire on the landscape has led us to develop over the last 10 years what we call the regional site network. So this is a set of sites that vary in age and in landscape position and represent the spatial and temporal dynamics of fire on this interior Alaska landscape. And we might drive out to some of these sites. We would probably drive a long distance, and then we would have to sit around and eat a little bit of lunch as we got out of the truck. And then Jill Johnston might show us some lodgepole pine that she had planted, thinking about its expansion north into the interior of Alaska. I might talk to you about changing successional trajectories and its effects on long-term composition of forests and on carbon dynamics, and we would talk about source sink dynamics in the boreal biome. All right, well, I want to just touch briefly on the goals of the program so you have a sense of what our organizational structure is. In this last round of funding, our goal was to understand the cross-scale and interactive effects of changing climate and disturbance regimes on Alaskan forests. And we wanted to study the associated consequences for regional feedbacks to the climate system. And then finally, identify the vulnerabilities and explore adaptation opportunities with rural Alaskan communities and land management agencies. And we have existed within this conceptual framework where you can see that climate is affecting disturbance and ecosystem structure, which in turn is affecting the regional landscape heterogeneity and connectivity. And it's these things that feed back to climate. We also are very interested in how social ecological systems might impact these interactions and how decisions from wildlife and fire management agencies similarly feed back to affect either the landscape, which then in turn affects climate, or to affect the actual disturbance regimes themselves. Now, I'm a disturbance ecologist, an ecosystem ecologist that focuses on disturbance. And so I've been very focused on understanding these three components of disturbance in interior Alaska. The first is this increasing, well, in this case, it's the handprint of fire, the thaw of permafrost soils that may have been frozen for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then finally, the impacts of pests and pathogens of these consumers on forest productivity and carbon storage processes. And we want to understand these disturbance regimes within the context of these cross-scale effects. So we've been very focused on understanding the spatial dependence of ecosystem and disturbance properties, understanding how changing disturbance affects the connectivity between ecosystems. So connectivity through the behavior of fire, through the lateral flow of water, through changing flow paths and thawing permafrost, and the spread of disease or the spread of insects between ecosystems as they move across the interior. Our other focus has been linking the present with the past. So linking present ecosystems to the thermal, material, or information legacies of past ecosystems. And because time is limited, I'm just going to give you a little taste of some of the science that's emerged on wildfire. And so, but before I show you that, I want to tell you that our work within this construct really is within a much broader array of ways of understanding. Our goal is to integrate and co-produce knowledge wisdom and goals for the boreal forest. I'm going to talk about natural sciences today, but you're also going to hear about these other areas where the LTER work is so important. So you're going to hear in the next talk from Beth, Leigh, and Lissy Goralnik about our collaborations with artists and writers and humanities scholars. And then tomorrow you can tune in for Katie Spellman is going to talk about some of our education and community science projects in a workshop in the morning. All right, well, let's start with fire. Here we are in the typic boreal black spruce forest where fire is combusting biomass, returning elements from the ecosystem to the atmosphere. And we've been very focused on trying to understand how much carbon is combusted in these fires. And also, how do these fires affect other element dynamics, nitrogen, phosphorus, and what are the consequences of both changes in that immediate combustion of carbon and changes in the availability of nutrients for what we think of as community reorganization, for this open space that is now regenerating to new forests. So I want to start here and just show you some icons of how we're linking field work, on the ground measurements of combustion with remote sensing to understand how drivers at different ecological scales, such as the density of black spruce or the drainage position on the landscape, we're using these types of understanding to then scale wildfire carbon emissions to the landscape scale. So this allows us to make estimates of the actual carbon emissions and to tune those emissions better so we can understand or infer some of the drivers of fire emissions. Now, it's not just the amount of carbon that's emitted during fire that's important for both short and long-term carbon balance and feedbacks to the atmosphere, but it's also the age of carbon. And we know in these cold forests that often soil organic carbon escapes burning. And as a result, it accumulates over multiple fire cycles. This links past and present ecosystems because that carbon is in the ecosystem, decomposing, turning over nutrients, supplying nutrients to the recovering forest. And so in order to understand the impact of changing fire regime on long-term carbon balance, we really need to understand what happens to these legacy carbon stocks. And some of our results show that deeper burning combusts this legacy carbon, especially in stands that burn young. And as a result, those stands losing this historic stock will become carbon sources to the atmosphere over the fire cycle. Now, here's a picture by one of the artists at Northern Arizona University, Victor Lekshik, and it shows you in this picture, it's the hands of fire, which in essence are the anthropogenic climate change hands of fire that are unlocking the vaults of legacy carbon. But it's not just carbon that gets unlocked, it's also new habitat for organisms, open space for regenerating forests. And so here's a picture of Jill Johnston that has been following forest regeneration across the regional site network and she's been following them since the 2004 megafires. And there she's looking pretty happy to see one little seedling. Now, what Jill has been looking at is understanding the spatial patterning that controls the regeneration, the amount and the composition of regenerating forest species after fire. And here are some examples of her work. And you can see in this case that in a moderately burned black spruce stand, she sees resilience, where in 2017, black spruce dominates the species composition of regenerating trees. But she's seen a lot of contrast. Approximately 60% of the sites that we originally established in 2004 have undergone a transition to either a mixed or to a deciduous dominated forest. And it's in the severely burned sites where the organic layer is combusted, exposing mineral soil seed beds, where we see a transition to dominance of broadleaf deciduous species like aspen and birch. So we've been motivated to understand what the consequences are of these alternative deciduous tree dominated successional trajectories for ecosystem properties. I've been motivated to understand long-term carbon balance. We're interested in understanding how this affects ecosystem energy exchange, and we're interested in how this might ultimately feed back to affect the fire regime and the propagation of that spatially patterned fire activity across the landscape. So these are some of our recent results. Well, recent in that they synthesized 17 years of our work in the Bonanza Creek LTER. And what we found is that while those sites that burn most severely, that then transition to deciduous dominance, those sites lost the most carbon from both the above ground and the below ground materials, fuels in the ecosystem, that those sites transition to high productivity broadleaf deciduous species. And as a result, if we incorporate both the fire-driven loss of carbon and then the recovery of carbon over longer timescales of approximately 100 years, we found that that initial severe burning carbon loss was offset by the high productivity of deciduous trees. And we've been working for maybe the last decade on ideas about why processes, the fluxes of carbon between the ecosystem and the atmosphere, and then the soil, plant-soil microbial interactions that drive carbon dynamics, why those are so different in these different, compositionally different forests. And so we've come up with this idea of these domains of stabilizing plant-soil microbial feedbacks that maintain these trajectories of biogeochemistry over the long successional time scale. So you can see here that fire is driving changes in organic layers, that this impacts soil and permafrost, that in turn impacts the regeneration of nutrients from decomposing tissues and from decomposing organic soil. That leads to effects on productivity. We know that vascular productivity is relatively low in black spruce stands, but that moss productivity can be very high. Slow growing, moist moss carpets that decompose very slowly. This results in long nitrogen residence times in black spruce forests, low litter quality, and slow decomposition. In the warm forests, we have warm, well-drained soils. These are the forests that emerge after severe burning. We see fast nutrient regeneration, high vascular NPP, high allocation to above ground materials, and then a relatively short nitrogen residence time as it turns over both within the plant bodies and then within the soil. The production of high quality litter and fast decomposition. So this is a model that we've been using to understand the stabilizing feedbacks that drive these long-term carbon cycling trajectories. Oops. All right, and I just wanted to emphasize that one of the crucial differences between these two trajectories is the presence or the absence of mosses. One of the graduate students in Jill Johnston's lab, Melody Jean, who's now a faculty member in Canada, who is online right now, much of her work was focused on understanding why moss are present in black spruce forests, but are largely absent from deciduous forests. And so we think of mosses as this keystone species that interact with microbes, plants, and soils to drive those differences in these carbon cycling trajectories. All right. So another question that if you attended our session on fire self-regulation yesterday, you know that this came up many times. So will the expansion of deciduous stands associated with higher severity burning, could this feedback in this spatially complex landscape to actually reduce fire activity? We know that deciduous stands tend to be less flammable than conifer stands. And if they do burn, fires spread more slowly and tend to combust less carbon because, well, there's just less fuel in fine materials that's combustible. So we're really curious to know about how the expansion of deciduous stands on the landscape might reduce fire activity. And recently we've become focused on trying to understand how this might be used to better understand the protection or the mitigation of increasing fire on people in the boreal forests, both in urban areas like Fairbanks, Anchorage, Whitehorse, and in rural communities like shown here. And we're really interested in how we might use this ecological knowledge that I've shown you, understanding patterns of combustion, understanding patterns of forest regeneration and how they relate to soil disturbance, and then understanding patterns of flammability and how they play out over successional timescales, and then how those play out across the landscape. So basic ecology that's being contributed, but because this is the built environment, because fuel breaks are constructed by humans, we need to understand the cost, the construction, the efficacy, and then finally the social acceptance, how people will use these fuel breaks, whether they're willing to have them near their houses or on their land, how fuel breaks affect how people feel about the land, and how they feel about the risk that they face with increasing fire. And we're working with a large group of collaborators throughout Alaska and into Canada, as well as with institutions in the lower 48 to develop an integrated social ecological understanding of the design of living fuel breaks, like these deciduous stands, that mitigate the impacts of increasing fire. Okay, so I'm going to end here by thanking the LTER group. You can imagine that our group itself has not met in person for a long time. We've spent most of the last year and a half in this format, meeting remotely. And as we move towards me as the new principal investigator of the program, we've really been working on developing more integration so that when we do get back together, we're going to be able to move forward with really fantastic science that addresses both critical basic questions in boreal ecology, but also expands to the landscape, to the communities in the landscape, and helps us understand the changing feedbacks between the boreal forest and climate. So I want to thank here the leadership team for the LTER, Mary Beth, Leigh, Krista Mulder, Teresa Hollingsworth, Jay Jones, part of this team, but really important in their own right for making everything continue to run is the site manager, Jamie Hollingsworth, and the information manager, Jason Downing, and then two lab and field technicians, Carl Olson and Mark Winterstein. Now, there are many senior scientists on the LTER. You see some of them here. There are many students, postdocs, and visiting researchers that have contributed to the program. And then finally, you're going to hear about in the next talk, this fantastic and really dynamic and active group of artists, writers, and humanities scholars that are bringing the Bonanza Creek science. Well, it's like scientists are learning from artists and artists are learning from scientists, and together we're moving forward to co-produce new knowledge, wisdom, and new goals for the boreal forest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you for the great presentation, the field trip, and such a beautiful description of the culture and the scientific identity of the LTR at Bonanza Creek. I'll open the floor for questions or remarks about Michelle's talk. Anyone? Okay, Clément. I'll ask you to unmute. Okay, Clément Hardy.
Yes, would it be okay to ask a quick question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. It was a really interesting presentation. Maybe I missed it, but I was wondering if I was really interested about this switch toward more deciduous forest that might stock more carbon. And one of the questions that I asked myself is, how do you think this will interact with climate change? Like, we know that we have an atmosphere that is more saturated in CO2, we have warmer seasons, we have more growth seasons, apparently, more days of growth season in boreal forests. Do you think that this could help the transition even more towards deciduous forests? Are deciduous forests maybe a bit more adapted than black spruce, for example, to those new climate conditions?
Oh, that's a super interesting question. So we know that the relative growth rate of these broadleaf deciduous trees is substantially higher than the relative growth rate of black spruce. We know, though, well, both functional groups are sensitive to drought, but so that's one question. The first question I would ask about CO2 fertilization is, well, how do the different drought responses of these species affect their ability to respond to increasing CO2? And I bet there are people out here that have some ideas about that. I would be really excited to hear some ideas about that. But I think also on a longer time scale, there are a series of what I think of as negative feedbacks to climate warming that come from deciduous forests. The first is this capacity to potentially store somewhat more carbon than the black spruce forest. The second is the substantially higher albedo, so reflectance of incoming radiation in the deciduous forest, particularly in the springtime when the leaves are off the trees and the snow is reflective. And then the third thing is, as I mentioned, the ability of deciduous forests to either resist or to sort of down regulate fire. So if fire ignites, it's going to spread less rapidly and it's going to combust less carbon. So those are three kind of longer term, larger scale feedbacks to carbon cycling and climate that are all negative. But I'm really curious about the CO2 question. So I think keep that question and keep asking it.
Yeah, but I'm very interested about what you said about albedo, because for the few things that I read, some are saying that broadleaf species would have maybe, I don't remember if it's a higher or lower albedo, especially in winter when the snow is there. So are you saying that if you have deciduous species, you have a higher albedo in the winter, so it's even more radiative forcing that is lowered?
Right, so it's reducing, let's see, a larger proportion of incoming shortwave radiation is reflected primarily in the springtime where there's light, but there are no trees on the canopy and there's snow on the ground. So as a result, the RNet, the net radiation absorbed by the ecosystem, is somewhat lower in these deciduous stands than it is in evergreen stands that have dark canopies that absorb a larger proportion of incoming shortwave radiation.
Super interesting, and I mean a bit reassuring concerning the last report of the IPCC to know that there are such negative feedbacks in the boreal forests. I'm not sure it will be enough, but still reassuring. Thank you very much, Michelle.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments? I guess I have one. I'm wondering to what well, it's more of a remark than a question. I'm wondering to what extent the impact of defoliators and repeated impact of defoliators may affect the potential negative feedback of transitioning from a more evergreen dominated vegetation to a more deciduous dominated vegetation.
Yes, this is a brilliant question, and it's one of the main foci of our upcoming grant renewal. So if we do move towards this more deciduous landscape, we know that these, well, fast-growing species tend to be more tasty to insect herbivores, defoliators. They also seem to be more susceptible to a suite of pathogens, like different types of fungal and bacterial pathogens. So what if we shift towards more deciduous dominance and then the forests become more vulnerable to pests, pathogens, and drought? I think it's a super important question, and it's something where the modeling in the next round of the LTER proposal is going to go so that we can better understand how this could play out.
Oh, it's 50. Okay. Well, thank you again, Michelle, and really thank you again for that initial virtual field trip. That was really nice. So now I guess we'll transition to Beth Leigh presentation and Lissy Goralnik. So yeah, Beth, I think you're gonna take the lead. So are you gonna share your screen? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
See your PowerPoint and yes, the presentation. So yeah, you good to go.
Okay, thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you all for the invitation to speak at the conference, and welcome everybody once again from Fairbanks, where I'm located. My name's Beth Leigh, and I'm a professor here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and my specialties are microbial ecology and also arts, humanities, science integration, and I'm going to talk a little bit about both today. And I'm going to share with you some more in-depth analysis of our work here at Bonanza Creek LTER with an effort to integrate ecological science with the arts and humanities, with a particular focus on place and environment, especially the boreal forest, and a program that we call In a Time of Change, or ITOC for short. And my presentation is going to include a lot of collaborative elements from our many artists, and I'll be able to feature some of their work today, as well as humanities scholars, writers, and scientists. And my collaborator, Lissy Goralnik, who's a social scientist who helps us to understand the impacts of these collaborative experiences on the participants, as well as audiences that view the resulting art exhibits. So what is In a Time of Change, or ITOC? It's a program that's based within Bonanza Creek LTER. And it was founded in 2008 by a group of us from LTER and UAF, and also independent artists and writers from Fairbanks. And our goal is to help facilitate transdisciplinary collaborations and produce events and exhibits that are focused on a variety of different social ecological themes, with climate change as a very common undercurrent. And our rationale for doing this is just the recognition that the arts, humanities, and environmental sciences bring together different pieces or different perspectives on the natural world, and putting these different perspectives together is important to solving some of the grand ecological, social ecological challenges that we face today, like rapid environmental change, and could be more successful than these disciplines working in isolation. This program is funded by the National Science Foundation through Bonanza Creek LTER, as well as through other grants to individual PIs and other organizations that contribute. And in general, the way we do this is that we have a multi-step approach that usually runs over the course of 2 or sometimes more years, where we first invite interested artists and writers to apply. And so then we competitively select ones that are interested in the program, and then facilitate interactions and collaborations with scientists through things like field trips together, lectures and workshops, and even social gatherings. And then the artists and writers and scholars produce original works, and we help to also produce those and present those to the public. And over the years, we've done a variety of different formats, including live performances and art exhibits and literary readings. And then our research component on this is to measure the attendance and engagement at these events, and also the impacts on people that are involved and people who've experienced the exhibits and performances. And we've done 5 major projects so far since 2008, including a performance that was focused on wildfire. That was our initial exhibit with an emphasis on literary readings, and then a performance with an art exhibit focused on climate change and trying to take a positive and even in some cases kind of lighthearted approach to envisioning the future, recognizing that we can't, at this point, it's hard to stop the trajectory of change that we're on completely, providing some guidance on how we could slow it, but also just helping people plan for a different future here in the circumpolar north. We had another exhibit focused on fire, and one also focused on predator control and the complicated trophic dynamics and cascading effects that occur when predators are removed. And then our most recent project that we've completed is called Microbial Worlds, and it was focused on the many important roles of microbes in environmental and human health. And I'll give you some specific examples from this program in my presentation today to give you a sense of how it works and some highlights of some of the artwork. In this project, we had 14 different artists and writers that are all listed here. And this program started in 2015 and resulted in an exhibit in 2017 that's been touring ever since. And this program involved, of course, field trips. Here's a majority, not all of the artists on a bus heading out to the field. It's always a wonderful, exciting group, very engaged with lots of excellent questions and ideas to contribute. So we took a field trip to Bonanza Creek LTER. Here's Jamie Hollingsworth drilling a permafrost core. We also went up to the Arctic to Toolik Field Station on this trip for a 5-day trip that we spent with scientists and learned more about environmental change and the research happening up at Toolik Field Station. The artists collected samples wherever they went and analyzed them in the lab. So one component of this project was a series of lectures and lab activities that helped to train the artists as microbiologists. So they had a mini microbiology course, and we loaned them microscopes. So they were able to culture and also view microbes that they collected. And everybody developed their own line of interest and often formed collaborative relationships with each other and or with scientists in areas they were interested in. And then the artists, in this case, Leigh went back to their studios and produced work for the exhibit. Here's Leigh printing her own fabrics for her beautiful textile art quilts that she presented along with the other artwork in the Microbial World exhibits, which premiered in 2017 and then has toured around Alaska, as well as a portion of it went to Turku in Finland and the lower 48 of the United States. And it's still installed now at the Pratt Museum in Homer, Alaska. And I'll give you a few highlights, but if you'd like to see much more of the artwork and read the artist statements, I highly encourage you to visit our website, itoc.alaska.edu. And you can see the artwork from Microbial Worlds, but also our other previous exhibits. And here's one example of a piece that appeared in Microbial Worlds. This is a beautiful art quilt that was a collaboration between Charlotte Bird and Leigh Nancaro, and it really encompasses some beautiful dimensions of the boreal forest with a focus on mycorrhizal symbioses with our trees. And you can see here in this is a very large wall quilt. Charlotte Bird made this top piece that shows the extensive hyphal network shown as stitching here and its relationship to the roots of these plants and the fruiting bodies and even a little cache of mushrooms below ground. And then the way that this team of Rhee and Charlotte collaborate is that one of them creates a quilt and then the second one responds to it with another one. So when Rhee saw this quilt, she made this amazing close-up of the relationship, the intimate relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and the roots of plants here. Another factor that we studied, of course, was permafrost, which is an important driving force in the boreal forest. And it's, of course, a rapidly changing aspect in the circumpolar north. So we drilled a permafrost core and everyone got to handle this and look at it. But also collaborations emerged on this theme, like this one. This shows some of the microbes that were cultured out of permafrost by Robin Barbado, who's an Army Corps of Engineers, Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab scientist. And she cultured these microbes from permafrost and shared them with Nancy Housel-Johnson, who incorporated them into this beautiful tile piece. So here's the whole piece on the wall. And what this shows is frozen permafrost that hasn't thawed yet. These are the microbes you would culture from that. And as the permafrost has experienced greater extents and longer lengths of time of being thawed, the microbial diversity increases, which you can see here. And this is sort of inspired by a temperature probe showing the warming permafrost and the microbial diversity therein by Nancy Housel-Johnson. We also went underground into the permafrost tunnel, which is located outside of Fairbanks, with Army Corps of Engineers scientists, and learned more about the huge amount of carbon that's locked in this Pleistocene permafrost here in interior Alaska. And of course, the implications of permafrost thaw, which are visualized in this way. We see this coming soon within the next month as the lakes start to freeze, methane bubbles frozen in the ice. And these are, of course, beautiful to look at and very inspiring to the artists, many of whom didn't know that these bubbles contain methane. And this led to another quilt by Rhee Nancaro called Deceptive Beauty that highlights these beautiful bubble patterns in the ice, but also the fact that this is, while it's beautiful, it's also a little scary, right? So sure, it's beautiful, but there's something deceptive about that beauty, that it contains something that's contributing to the rapid change of the environment, of course, methane gas. And I like how this quilt includes different dimensions from the landscape level down to the microbial scale, the microbes that are producing the methane from the carbon encased in that thawing permafrost beneath a lake. And it also highlights a scientist. This is Katie Walter Anthony, and she and Rhee and other scientists took a field trip out to take a look at these methane bubbles in the lake. And Katie's expertise is quantifying the bubbles of methane that are coming out of these permafrost thaw lakes and other environments to help us better project the greenhouse gas emissions and resulting climate change. And as many of you know, you can light these bubbles on fire. So here's Katie and one of her collaborators doing so. And as many of you know, here in the circumpolar north, we have permafrost anywhere from continuous to discontinuous, but it's rapidly disappearing. And we estimate that by 2100, between 20 and 90% of this permafrost will be gone, which of course creates this positive feedback loop where a warming climate releases more of this undecomposed organic matter from permafrost that gets processed by microbes into greenhouse gases like methane, as well as CO2 that accelerates warming. So this is a very alarming situation. And became an inspiration for a lot of different artworks, including this gorgeous piece by Gail Priday, which I also think has a wonderfully punny title in permafrost, implying that what we've considered permanently frozen soil is no longer permanent. And you can see the microbes there awakening. Another dimension of this project took place in the far north of Finland, and also focused on decomposition, but of more recent organic matter. And this is a collaboration between me and my research group with Stephanie Ray Dixon, who's a multimedia artist and costume designer, and as well as photographer and videographer. And she joined my research team as an artist in residence for 3 field seasons at Kevo Subarctic Research Station in northern Finland. So if there are any Finns here today, hello. I had such a wonderful time working there, and I hope to go back someday. Stephanie, this is Stephanie. She's an artist based in New York who joined us there and did all of the scientific work alongside us, including collecting samples and doing leaf litter decomposition studies with a postdoc, Mary Catherine Levis. And then during each field trip, we would also spend some time flipping the lab around so that we became her assistants and helped her to construct costumes. These are dresses made out of a burlap fabric onto which we sewed local biomass. And then Stephanie took photos and videos of us in these dresses, and then incorporated some of the scientific research into how she processed these dresses, which I'll go into details on in a minute. So here's an example of a photograph of one of us in one of the dresses in the field in our research site. And then one of the components of our research was to study the decomposition of the different birch litters and to examine how the secondary chemistry of those plants affected microbial decomposition rates, as well as microbes that were actively involved. And this, of course, follows a fairly standard protocol of collecting senescent leaves, putting them into litter bags, and then deploying them on the surface of the soil or burying them, and then collecting them 1 or 2 years later. And then we would measure the mass loss of the leaf litter and identify the microbes that had colonized the litter using DNA analyses. And Stephanie adopted that idea into her artwork. So she created these dresses. Of course, we did photos and videos in them, but she buried them then. And every year we'd go back and dig them up and examine the decomposition. So here's a dress that's been buried for, I believe, 2 years at this point. And you can see the bleach marks on this red dress from probably the peroxidase enzymes from the fungi involved in decomposition. And then she had us wear them again and for repeat photography and videography. So here's a dress that's been decomposing for a year out on the surface of the soil. Actually, she also buried us, which was an interesting experience. And I'd have to say, as a scientist, contributed to my appreciation of how much microbes do under very cold conditions, because I've measured the temperature of these soils repeatedly, but I didn't fully appreciate how cold they were until I was buried in them myself, and appreciate how much decomposition can occur at such low temperatures in the Arctic regions of Finland. Here's a close-up of one of the sashes from one of the dresses, and you can see the microbes that have colonized here, this beautiful mat of hyphae on there. And so we also incorporated the scientific process into the artwork through one more step, and that was doing DNA analysis of the microbes that had colonized the dresses. And this was done in real time at the art exhibit opening by our genomics core lab coordinator at the time, Ian Harriott. And this is using a MinION sequencer. So this is a little handheld next generation DNA sequencer that you can just plug into a laptop using a USB drive. And so we could do real-time metagenomic analysis of the dresses in the gallery. The dresses were also embedded in resin and hanging here behind us. You can see them at different stages of decomposition with live tundra plants and photographs on the wall for this component of Microbial Worlds contributed by Stephanie Ray Dixon. And then collaborators Ursel Schutt, Devin Drown, Jennifer Moss helped to generate this nice graphic that went on the wall with it that shows the results of the metagenomic analysis of the dresses, that 73% of the DNA was from bacteria, including many unidentified things. That helps to point out the vast biodiversity of the microbial world and the fact that it's a very unknown frontiers, even still. And then the fraction of the DNA that was from eukaryotes, fungi, plants, and animals. So all this interaction with microbes prompted artist Jesse Hedden to declare, "Microbes are everywhere, worship the almighty microbe," and to even make icons inspired by religious icons that highlight microbes, as you see here. And she also pointed out the amazing ubiquity of microbes, how they're everywhere, by creating microbial wallpaper. And you can actually order this wallpaper in any color scheme you'd like. It's based on her hand drawings of different microbes she saw through the microscope, and you can wallpaper your house with it. So this exhibit, including many other artworks I didn't have time to highlight today, opened in 2017 in Fairbanks to an enormous crowd. It was, by all accounts, record-breaking attendance for a gallery opening. It was 2.5% of the population of Fairbanks came out to just the opening night, which was a really crowded space, but a really joyful time. One of the things that we're doing, in addition, again, to producing these exhibits, is to study the impacts of these collaborations, and especially the impacts of the art exhibit experience on audiences. Because one of our goals is to help increase engagement in science and in also understanding of ecosystems and climate change among the public. And so our collaborator, Lissy Goralnik from Michigan State University, put together a survey that we offered to the audience, and many people filled them out. And so this is some preliminary data from the survey of that opening night, showing just one of the questions that was addressed. Attending microbial worlds increased my knowledge about the role of microbes in ecosystems. And as you can see, the vast majority of people agreed or strongly agreed. And I think this is remarkable, given that it was already a highly educated audience, because we did collect demographic data. So even highly educated people learned something about microbes. We had lots of other questions, and including things like the majority of respondents were asked how the gallery exhibit experience affected them in other ways. And the majority of them reported increased motivation to learn more about microbes, which I think is a big success. If you just inspire people to want to learn more, I think that's an important step. Also, people reported increased knowledge about how ecosystems function, and importantly, the knowledge of effects of human activities on ecosystems, and an increased appreciation of science. We also asked people what they thought the role of the arts was in capturing their attention about important issues. And people highlighted the importance of visual representations, helping them understand scientific principles, and also the importance of emotional engagement, that these artworks spoke to their heart and captured their imagination, perhaps more so than just data and a scientific presentation. And this is consistent with the results of our previous research on our project called Trophic Cascades, which we've published. In that analysis, we also found that these collaborations have potential to catalyze relationships between the scholars who work together and the public and the natural world, and cultivate inspiration and empathy, which comes back to the importance of the emotional connection for the natural world, and spark awareness shifts that can enable pro-environmental behavior. And this idea is also not novel. It's popping up, it's been present for many years and is really increasing in frequency across the US and around the world. And in a recent study by Fred Swanson, he found that at least 100 sites across the US host arts and humanities programs. Many of them are LTER sites, but also museums, national parks, and others. And of course, there are many more in other countries. I have yet to see a count globally of these kinds of programs, but there's a really strong tradition in Europe as well that I'm aware of. And I'd love to learn about more. And I think that what we all share is this concern that the changing climate, is causing major changes in things like fire frequency, erosion, biodiversity loss, also famine and drought. And to address problems of this scale, we need more than science. So science is very good at telling us what we know about the world's ecosystems and their trajectories. But what we often forget is the second important piece. What are our feelings, values, and aspirations as a society as well? So this is something that the arts and humanities really address. In order to address a question like, what should we do about environmental change? This involves a conversation across all of these and many more disciplines that I haven't shown here, and society and the public. But we live, unfortunately, in a time where we have a disconnect between many of these disciplines and public discourse. So we hope to strengthen these connections through interdisciplinary community building to help re-engage people with their environment, stimulate empathy, humility, and wonder, and foster creativity and transdisciplinary problem solving, which is what we need. And as Michael Nelson, an environmental ethicist, puts it nicely, harness the full power of the human imagination, not just one dimension of it. So I'm happy to announce that we have a new project in progress that's going to be premiering in about a year from now, and it's focused on the boreal forest. It's called Boreal Forest Stories, and the theme of this one is incorporating narrative and storytelling into arts, humanities, science works that focus on many different dimensions of the boreal forest. We have a huge group of artists, individual teams, and even organizations from many different disciplines, including adding environmental educators, game designers, and filmmakers working together with scientists. So stay tuned for this exhibit and the tour that will follow, and also the book that we hope will come out the following year. And also, on a final note, I want to invite you to tune in to all of the artist talks coming up this week at the conference. Up next is Margo Klass, who's an artist who's been involved in many of these ITOC projects and has wonderful artworks she'll share with you. Tomorrow, Kess Woodward, Thursday, poet Susan Campbell, and Friday, artist Jesse Hedden. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to field any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. That was an awesome presentation, and as you said, I hope we'll continue featuring some of this work with the contribution of the artists you mentioned this week. I have maybe time for one question. Yes, yes, Dana Johnson.
Hi, Mary Beth. Thank you so much. That was a really cool talk to hear. I'm just curious, you mentioned that one thing you learned from this work was how cold decomposition can occur at, but how else do you think that working with these artists influenced your scientific understanding of microbial ecology?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, and one that we're often very interested in is how we can see how the arts and humanities help the sciences in the sense of helping with public engagement, but how do we turn it back and actually improve the science? And I think there are, I think one of the things that's done for me is help to activate my creativity and also see things in a different way, think outside the box through the great questions that and suggestions that I get asked. And I would say even the artist in residence, Stephanie, you made some important observations in the field that affected our research too. So there are scientific contributions like, that there was a fungal infection on some of the leaves. But I've also heard of many stories of things like technology transfer, artists, like for example, sound artists who have contributed some ecoacoustic technology to scientists in the field that they've used in composition and field recordings. But I think that I'm hopeful that it can also contribute to better communication of science through improved writing, storytelling, and yeah, just creativity in general. But I'm also excited to hear any stories other people have about how the arts and humanities have make them better scientists.
Yes. Thank you, Dana, for your question, and Mary Beth for your answer. I'm sorry, we'll have to move on to our first art exhibit with Margo Klass. Margo, can you share your screen? Okay, Margo, you are here. Okay. Can you talk just to make sure your mic is?
Okay, I'm trying to share the screen now.
Yeah.
Elaine, thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, Mary Beth. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me to join all of you. It's very impressive and a little forbidding to speak with such a group, but I'm happy to be here and show you some of my art. I live and work right outside of Fairbanks, Alaska, in the Boreal Forest, and this is my studio. It is separated by about 50 yards from the house, where I live, and it seems like a world away at times. I love that it requires that I climb the steps up into the trees and enter where 2 ceramic jars and a moose rack mounted above the door remind me that this was once the studio of another artist, the ceramics artist Jim Brashear at the university. He built the studio to be his creative space, and now I'm happy that it is mine. Inside, I have all kinds of materials organized and cataloged. I have bookboard, book cloth, papers, and a lot of wood gathered from the forest. This is what I like to work with. You see here the larger sticks and branches standing up against the wall. And here, some smaller pieces gathered into bins, a variety of woods, each selected, well, for what? Something about each one of these called out, and I picked it up and brought it home. Perhaps its shape, maybe its color, maybe that it's also perfectly straight. All of that plays a part. Lately, I've been collecting twigs like this for my new IOTC project. And I look at a stash like this and I see potential. Here's a carefully sorted bin of what I call flitches. And by that, I mean slices of wood, here mostly birch, that are cut, planed, and sanded for what I call making flitch books. Here's a grouping of them. You can see that they feature here mostly outer bark, or the one on the right, the inner wood, but they're typically very small, 3 to 5 inches tall, and feature some sort of clasp made of stone, ivory, perhaps bone, or other twigs. I consider these books art objects, not traditionally functional books, even though inside the covers there is a text block, which one could, of course, write in, but typically people do not. They hold them as they would an object, an art object. The covers are normally flanked on the spine side by birch sticks to both emphasize the spine and to frame the Coptic stitching pattern across the spine, holding the text block together. So I also collect all that wood in my studio to use in what I call creating box constructions. These are compositions of objects like this. Some of them are found objects. Many of them are from nature. Some I fabricate myself, and I arrange them within an architectural space. This construction, titled Early Snow, is typical of the pieces that refer to my living in the Alaskan landscape. Here, the specific reference is to an unusually heavy snow early in the winter of 1992 that caused many birch trees to remain bent over, and one can walk through the forest and identify these trees today. This happened long before I moved to Alaska, but so many people remember it. I was impelled to make this piece to remember it as well. So box constructions like this one are about the Alaskan landscape, but aesthetically, they're also about space, positive and negative, how objects relate to each other in that space, and very much about light. Typically, I include mica-filled windows and skylights to draw light into the box, and also, frankly, the viewer. At least that's my intended hope. This focus on the Alaskan landscape and the boreal forests didn't happen really until I moved to Alaska in 2004. This piece, called Unknown Place, indicates a turning point in my work, from emphasis on narrative subjects with all man-made found objects to my Alaskan surroundings. There are many boxes that directly refer to my experience of the boreal forest, especially snow, especially cold and long winters. This one is called First Snow. This one is called Snow Country. In this piece, January Light, I'm responding to the quality of light that occurs in deep winter when the light rakes at a certain angle across the interior and produces a very particular rosy pink glow, which I just love. This one, you can guess what this is about. I titled it Spring Run, and obviously refers to birch tapping in spring. The box constructions become architectural artist books when I add doors and closures like you see here. These are inspired by Northern Renaissance altarpieces, which also typically have doors and panels that open and close according to the liturgical season. This one is called Tea House North and is inspired by both the Alaskan landscape and my interest in Japanese art and culture. Here's another altarpiece construction. This one in homage to the beaver. It opens to a central image of a beaver tailbone, flanked by gnawed beaver sticks and secondary chambers inspired by beaver lodges. And of course, all of these sticks were not gathered from the forest, but rather from riversides on fishing trips with my husband. Other pieces are less specific and more meditative, I would say. They feature pieces of the forest collected while traveling and hiking and fishing in Alaska, but I'm using them here to draw attention to their aesthetic properties and to their juxtapositions to each other and their architectural spaces. This one is called Clearwater Creek Lodge. It features these logs. This is quite a large piece gathered at Clearwater Creek. And this one, titled Evensong, also meant to be more contemplative and quiet. Sometimes the constructions are about the boreal forest, but is expressed in found objects and not using the wood itself at all. Here's a short series of 4, all about the birch. This one is spring birch. This one is summer birch. Here's fall birch and winter birch. But birch doesn't get all the attention. Here's one titled Black Spruce. And this one, Nenana Burn, referring to a notable fire on the Nenana Ridge in 2015. Also, no real birch here, but all about the birch nonetheless. Now I want to circle back to working with birch exclusively. This piece tells the story, it really, I would say, contains the story of working with One Tree Alaska in collaboration with the Fairbanks Folk School and their very special program called Week in the Woods. The project involved harvesting one birch tree, albeit a very large one, which was cut apart and distributed to many artists and classrooms in Fairbanks. Those parts became inspiration for learning and material for artists to create pieces in many media for a culminating exhibition called Celebrating One Tree. My contribution was this piece, and I titled it Reading Room. So here you see a little tree house, all equipped with a chair for reading. And beside it is a veritable library which catalogs the many aspects of the project. Here's one of those little books, which tells the story of harvesting the tree. In it are photographs like this one. Here's John Manthei, director of the folk school at the time, cutting down the tree, and he is surrounded by many scientists and students and kids, people of all ages who are participating in the project. There's a lot of kid activity related to this project and learning about the birch and using it for all kinds of arts and crafts, including making crowns. Several of the books themselves, these are the little books in the library, are made from the tree itself. This one is a small flitch book, sewing on straps with a closure made of leather. And in it, it actually holds real specimens that catalog the parts of the tree. And so I collected parts of the tree and framed them, covered them with mica, and so collected in a way a DNA of the tree itself. This one is a small flitch book that you can relate to the others, and it features lots of prints of the leaves and the tree, of the twigs and the bark. And here's one that is nothing more than a little box of seeds contained in book form. Another book recalls the week I spent making birch books with middle school students, a part of the citizen science program that still is ongoing at One Tree, Alaska, and directed by Jan Daw. So you can see all of these books contain a lot of the activities that surrounded the initial One Tree project. I wanted to point out that one book contains poems about birch trees written by the students and more pieces of the tree, as you can see in the foreground here. Each book records a certain aspect of the project so that in the end, my hope was at least that we have a pretty complete visual record of the collaboration. So in closing, I would say that the boreal forest provides beautiful and challenging material with which to make art and endless inspiration for aesthetic responses. Personally, I don't see any end to my responding to where and how I live in Alaska. And of course, I'm looking forward to the next iteration of ITOC that specifically focuses on the boreal forest. And you heard about that from Mary Beth. So thank you very much for inviting me, Helene and Mary Beth, to share some of my art with you. And I hope I've left a little bit of time for questions.